In the summer of 1940, Britain was in terrible danger. Nazi Germany was planning to invade our shores. Only the fighter pilots of the Royal Air Force could stop them. 70 years ago, in these very skies above our head, there was a brutal and savage war that was waged, the outcome of which determined our very existence as a nation on this island. This is my brother Colin, who was a fighter pilot in the RAF and who served in some of our modern conflicts.
And I know from my experience there's a huge network of people supporting our pilots. And we want to discover how their contributions combined to give us victory in 1940.
And what it was that made the Battle of Britain Britain's finest hour. We've always been fascinated by the Battle of Britain. Now we're going to meet the real-life heroes who inspired us when we were kids. These are the last of the 3,000 pilots who saved our country. The men Winston Churchill called the few. We'll explore the technology that enabled the RAF to withstand the Nazi attack. We'll find out about the dangers the fighter pilots faced. And Colin will go through the same training as Battle of Britain airmen. If he makes the grade, he'll fly one of the greatest fighter planes of all time, the Spitfire. Amazing machines, extraordinary characters. So let us share with you one of the most remarkable stories in our history. June 1940. The leader of Nazi Germany, Adolf Hitler, was on a victory tour. Paris was the latest capital to fall to his invincible armies. In less than a year, almost all of Europe had been overrun. Only one small and isolated country was left in the war. Hitler was convinced that Britain would have to surrender, and soon. But the Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, was determined to continue the fight, whatever the cost. He rallied his countrymen with one of the few weapons he had: words.
What General Weygand has called the Battle of France is over. The Battle of Britain is about to begin.
Upon this battle depends the survival of Christian civilization. Upon it depends our own British life, and the long continuity of our institutions and our empire. The whole fury and might of the enemy must very soon be turned on us. Hitler knows that he will have to break us in this island or lose the war. Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duties, and so bear ourselves, that if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will still say, this was their finest hour.
We did expect an invasion. I mean, all the signposts had been taken down and all the names on stations and things, which gave you a sense of something serious could happen.
Only 20 miles away, there was the most powerful army and air force in the world. So on one or two occasions it was suggested that the invasion bells were going to be rung, and yes, it was a bit heart-stopping that might be the last battle.
The German invasion was codenamed Operation Sea Lion. It had to take place in September before the weather turned bad and the English Channel became too rough to cross. The first step was for the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, to destroy the RAF so they could land troops on the south coast. Only a few fighter pilots could prevent this invasion. The fate of our country depended on their skill and their courage. You know, they were fighting for us, that we're all sitting here because of what they did. You know, we all owe them a great deal of gratitude for that. I think in the RAF there's a real camaraderie with the pilots that's very like a brotherhood, like a fraternal kind of thing going on there. So having a couple of brothers tell the stories maybe not such a bad idea.
I flew one of the RAF's frontline fast jets, the Tornado GR4. It was big, heavy, but really responsive, really comfortable, lots of power. Very nice airplane to fly.
I was able to fly once with Colin in his Tornado. They arranged for me to take a ride in the navigator's seat. And when we took off, the feeling of acceleration and the force of you push back into your seat, flying at that speed was just unbelievable. He was completely relaxed, completely in his zone. And I was so proud of him. I've never felt such pride, really, before. I was able only to see the corner of his helmet down the side of the cockpit. But I'd never seen him at work before, you know, in flying this extraordinary aircraft.
This is where my RAF career began, Cranwell in Lincolnshire. It's a spiritual home of the Air Force, the place where raw recruits have been turned into officers, almost since the RAF began. When I arrived here 20 years ago, I was just the latest in a long line of airmen. Many Battle of Britain pilots went to Cranwell too.
And this filtering process proved...
I spent 18 weeks at Cranwell before graduating as an RAF officer. But it was only then that my flying training began. It was another 4 years before I was sent to the front line. In my case, Iraq. 70 years ago, it was very different. The RAF was so short of men that training was cut back. Inexperienced pilots had as little as 10 hours solo flying before being sent to the front line.
Facing them was a truly formidable enemy. The Luftwaffe had been battle-hardened by years of war. It had fought campaign after campaign across Europe. Every enemy it encountered, it had destroyed. Key to its success was one of the best fighter planes of all time, the Messerschmitt 109. The 109 could cruise at 350 miles an hour and was armed with 2 cannon, which could blast enemy planes out of the skies. On the eve of battle, the German High Command was super confident. They outnumbered the RAF by 4-1. This campaign would be like all the others. They would crush the Royal Air Force in a matter of weeks. The RAF faced almost overwhelming odds, but it did have one secret weapon which helped level the playing field: radar. These masts outside Dover are the last survivors of what was in 1940 the most sophisticated air defense system in the world. Radar worked by sending out a radio beam. If the beams hit enemy aircraft, they bounced back. Radar gave the RAF 20 minutes warning of a German attack. It allowed Fighter Command to send the right amount of aircraft to the right place at the right time. In 1940, Britain had a chain of these masts all along the coast. But they were just the front line of the air defense system. Inland, there was also the Observer Corps, 30,000 plane spotters who tracked each enemy raid. Information from radar and the Observer Corps was sent to Fighter Command headquarters. They then alerted the fighter groups who'd scramble their planes. The mastermind behind this system was the head of Fighter Command. He's a hero of the Battle of Britain, though few nowadays would know his name. To find out more about him, I've dragged Colin away from his training to meet Stephen Bungay, a Battle of Britain expert. So who was this guy who was in charge of Fighter Command at that time?
He was a teetotaler who lives with his sister, who talks to the dead, believes in fairies, and thinks that he is the reincarnation of a 13th century Mongol chieftain. So this is the guy in charge of Fighter Command in 1940.
And this was Dowding?
Hugh Caswell Tremenhere Dowding.
Tremenhere Dowding,
Yes,
what a name.
right. However, he had 2 characteristics, along with all this eccentricity, that above all others were needed then. which was great imagination and great attention to detail. And you often found those in different people. He brought them all together.
Right.
And he constructed, between the time he took over Fighter Command, 1936, and when war broke out, what is by far the most formidable air defence system in the world. It's one of the most extraordinary intellectual and technological feats of the 20th century. It is, in fact, I mean, it's so far forward-looking. What he created, in fact, was an internet, except that it was analogue, so you didn't send emails, right?
Yeah.
You sent something on the teleprinter, and you didn't grab your BlackBerry or whatever. It was the telephone. Same principle, a network, a command and control system, which didn't only mean that everybody could talk to everybody, but it was extremely robust.
Amazingly, an updated version of Dowding's system still protects us today. I've come to RAF Scampton in Lincolnshire, a modern radar station, to see how it works. So, Mark, what are we looking at on the screen here?
OK, primarily we're looking at the UK airspace, really, and the number of aircraft that are flying within it at one given time.
So every line on the screen there represents a flight?
Absolutely. I mean, every plot represents a radar return.
OK. And you're looking at civilian aircraft and military aircraft?
The whole raft of them.
Everything that's
Absolutely.
in the air?
Yeah, all of it.
How big an area are we looking at?
We're looking at basically 1 million square miles.
1 million square miles?
1 million square miles.
My goodness, wow. Wow. The technology is light years ahead of what they had in 1940, but the system is pretty much the same. If rogue aircraft are spotted, then fighters are scrambled. It's something they train for time and time again.
HD, I have 2 unidentified aircraft coming in from the north.
QRA, man up!
What's happening?
OK, we've got 2 aircraft that have entered UK airspace. They've not met the rules and procedures for routing and recognition. So what we're doing now is that we're getting everyone in, including the Master Controller, to look at these aircraft and see what threat they present to us, and if necessary, he'll take tactical action.
Codex B operations and QRA. This is the Scampton Master Controller. Acknowledge. Climb flight level 400. Set speed Mach 1.2.
Yeah, so he's scrambling the aircraft now in response to the 2 unknown aircraft in the north of the airspace.
For QRA, call signs Q1 and Q2. Scramble, scramble, scramble. Acknowledge.
These Typhoons are doing the same job as Spitfires 70 years ago, but back then there were no training exercises. Every scramble was for real. By July 1940, the Luftwaffe was ready to launch its air onslaught. More than 1,000 fighters and 1,800 bombers were poised to strike. The Battle of Britain was about to begin. For Hitler's invasion to take place, the Nazis had to drive the Royal Navy out of the Channel. Then they could ferry tens of thousands of troops across to the south coast. It was the job of the Luftwaffe's bombers to destroy the British ships. One of these attacks was recorded by the BBC.
There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, there are about 10 German machines dive bombing the British convoy, which is just out to sea in the Channel. There's one going down on its target now.
On bases across the country, airmen waited for the order to intercept the bombers. Tom Neal was a 20-year-old Hurricane pilot. On his radio, he could hear the build-up of each German attack.
This information would be relayed to us, and we'd be standing there, and the information could, 20, 40, 60, 80, 100, 200, 300, oh my God, 300, 400. And you knew they were coming towards you, and you look round, and there were just 12 of you. Where do you start,
Guarding the bombers were the Messerschmitt 109s. Tackling these fighters was an almost impossible task for rookie pilots.
They'd rush up behind us 100 miles an hour faster than us, fire their guns from very close range, then disappear, either upwards or downwards. We could never catch them. Because they used to watch us attacking the bombers, and they used to come down and attack us from behind.
Surviving the first few dogfights was a lottery for inexperienced pilots. Tony Iveson had only 10 hours on a Spitfire before he was sent to his fighter squadron.
The first few trips were the most dangerous, but you just had to be lucky, and I mean that. I don't know why one was selected to be lucky, but you had to be.
Despite the lack of experienced pilots, the RAF put up a good fight. German planes were shot down at a rate of 2 to 1. But the Nazis still sunk so many ships that within 2 weeks, the Royal Navy stopped sailing through the Channel. In the Battle of Britain, it was round 1 to the Germans. Everyone's heard of the Spitfire. It's one of the most famous aircraft of all time. But there were 2 British fighters in 1940. The other, often overlooked aircraft, is the Hurricane. There were 1,700 Hurricanes and less than 400 Spitfires. The Hurricane was the workhorse of the Battle of Britain. The Hurricane was never as eye-catching as its rival. It was lumpier and bumpier, based on a much older aircraft design. Chop the top wing off a biplane and you see how the Hurricane evolved. Only the front end had a metal skin. The rear section was built out of a wooden frame covered in canvas. It sounds primitive, but this made the Hurricane easy to repair. The Hurricane had the same Merlin engine as the Spitfire, but it was less aerodynamic, so it was never as fast. If there was one man who confirmed some of those Nazi stereotypes, then it was the supersized head of the Luftwaffe, Hermann Göring. Göring was vain and arrogant. He was so confident of success that he bought himself a new white suit and a shiny gold baton, just to celebrate victory in the Battle of Britain. Göring exuded confidence, but he had a dark secret, and one that affected his leadership during the Battle of Britain. Göring was a junkie.
He got wounded in the groin, and as a result was treated with morphine and became a morphine addict, which has a rather strange effect on people's moods. It can make them very pessimistic and then over-optimistic. It can cloud their judgment. He had no understanding of technology. He had no understanding of how to organize a complex modern military organization, and there he was, in charge of the most sophisticated of Germany's armed forces.
Göring put his faith in the German warrior spirit, as well as the Luftwaffe's superior numbers of planes and men. After a month of fighting over the Channel, he was ready for the next step. Göring would take the war to the British mainland. The German plan was codenamed Eagle Attack. It would be the biggest air campaign seen so far in history.
Eagle Attack began on the 12th of August 1940 with a raid along the south coast. 3 radar stations were bombed, put out of action. Without the RAF's eyes and ears, a huge stretch of southern England was wide open to attack. Emergency work began to repair the system. Partial radar coverage was eventually restored. The masts had been difficult targets for the Luftwaffe to hit, and even when they had been bombed, the RAF had got them up and running again. Göring concluded that the attacks had been a waste of time. He cancelled further systematic bombing of the radar network. Leaving Britain's air defence system in place was Göring's first great error. Whenever the Luftwaffe attacked, radar would be watching, and the RAF would be waiting.
3 days later, on the 15th of August, the Germans launched the second phase of Eagle attack with a massive raid on the Midlands and North. Goering believed the RAF was so short of pilots and planes that every one of its fighter squadrons had been sent to defend the southeast. He sent more than 100 bombers to attack northern England with no fighters to protect them. When they arrived over the Yorkshire coast, they had a nasty surprise.
We were having lunch, and the whole squadron suddenly heard on the RT 616 squadron, scramble, scramble. And we dashed out and got in our planes and all took off in all directions. And we were sort of fallen up, and we was vectored on to about 80 Junks 88s. And they were unescorted, and they were flying in formation. You couldn't miss them.
The Luftwaffe had underestimated the strength of the RAF, and they were severely punished for it. 75 German aircraft were shot down. Luftwaffe pilots called it Black Thursday.
One day later, the Luftwaffe attacked again. More than 400 aircraft pounded targets along the south coast. Keith Park was the commander of 11 Group, which covered the southeast, the front line in the Battle of Britain. Park was scrambling squadron after squadron to repel the German attack, when in the heat of battle, the Prime Minister Winston Churchill suddenly showed up.
Churchill decided to visit Fighter Command's 11 Group headquarters in Uxbridge. He turned up unannounced as so often and watched events, and he said that when he realised that Park had got all his fighters into the sky, he felt sick with fear. The margins, he said, were so small.
One of the pilots Keith Park scrambled was Nigel Rose. He was only 22, but had never been in combat before.
We saw this enormous gaggle of aircraft coming in, and for one who'd never seen one single German aircraft before, to see, my squadron commander said there were 100, about 50 bombers and 50 fighters. And when you see all these in one huge, great gaggle of various heights and so on, that was quite impressive. So one thought, well, turn the gun button to fire, and your squadron commander sort of said, well, pick your man. So we came round and firing 8 Browning machine guns at once. Some smoke came out of the aircraft. This is a Messerschmitt 110. And one thought, gosh, I must have hit him or something. He turned over on his back and went absolutely vertically downwards. And I thought, gosh, this is, being in a fighter squadron, and surely this one I can claim.
Some planes were fitted with cameras to film these battles in the skies. Amazingly, a few frames survive of the moment Nigel Rose fixed a German plane in his gun sights. For Winston Churchill, the 16th of August had been a deeply moving day. He'd seen for himself the almost impossible odds the RAF's fighter pilots faced.
Churchill drove away in the afternoon, and he turned round to General Ismay, one of his aides, in the car as they were driving back to London, and said, "Never in the field of human conflict so much been owed by so many to so few." A few days later, of course, Churchill wove them into the speech that he gave in the House of Commons.
The great air battle which has been in progress over this island for the last few weeks has recently attained a high intensity. The gratitude of every home in our island, in our empire, and indeed throughout the world, except in the abodes of the guilty, goes out to the British airmen, who, undaunted by odds,
unwearied in their constant challenge and mortal danger, are turning the tide of the world war by their prowess and by their devotion. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few.
At the height of the Battle of Britain, there were around 1,300 fighter pilots. It really is the case that our country's fate depended on the few. 70 years on, their ranks have thinned, Now only 100 or so remain. So for us, it's a privilege to meet 2 of them.
I don't think I know the meaning of the word instinct.
Geoffrey Wellham was 17 years old when he joined up. He recounted his experiences as a Spitfire pilot in an autobiography called First Light. It's a classic account of the Battle of Britain. Bob Foster was 20 and flew Hurricanes in the summer of 1940. He was a crack fighter pilot who shot down 7 German planes.
When you first stepped into your Hurricane and you into your Spitfire, and you landed it successfully and stepped out and kind of survived that first experience. I mean, how did you feel? Were you really elated that you felt you'd really? I'm now a fighter pilot.
And in my case, a little bit thankful. Really? I looked down and there was the ground. I must have landed. The Spitfire's landed with Jeff Wellham in it.
A month into the Battle of Britain, and Goering was under pressure. His strategy for the destruction of Fighter Command was not going to plan. Goering had assumed that the Luftwaffe would crush the RAF, just as it had crushed every other enemy, by shooting its planes out of the skies. But the radar network and the RAF's pilots and planes had proved a match for the Germans. After weeks of air combat, the RAF was holding its own. Goering's new strategy was to destroy the RAF not in the air, but on the ground. If fighter stations were bombed, it would be difficult to take off and land. Exhausted pilots would be unable to rest. A key target was the RAF base which covered the main attack route to London, Biggin Hill. In its heyday, Biggin Hill was the most famous and important airbase in the country. Its Spitfires and Hurricanes shot down 1,600 Luftwaffe planes. Those glory days are long gone now. The Air Force left Biggin Hill 20 years ago. I visited the base just before it shut down. I came here in 1987, and this was my first experience of the RAF. This is where I went through my selection to join the Air Force. So this was before Cranwell. And I had no concept at the time as to how important a base this was in the overall campaign, during 1940. But walking around these buildings now, you get a real sense of the past and of the ghosts, because this place took a real pounding by the Luftwaffe, and it was right on the front line. Seeing these sleeping quarters and the dispersal areas here at Biggin Hill is really brought home to me just how intense that period was. The guys weren't just fighting for their lives in the air, 4 or 5 sorties a day, but they were fighting for their lives on the ground as well, and they were living under the constant threat of bombings. And I'm used to combat sorties where you can come back at the end of a day, and albeit it's to an air-conditioned tent somewhere in the desert, but at least it's kind of home and you've got good food and you can sleep undisturbed. But for these guys, it was just constant, and the stress must have been incredible, and they must have wondered how long they could keep that up, how much more they could take.
With the Battle of Britain now in its 7th week, combat stress was beginning to tell. Many pilots were being scrambled into action 4 or 5 times a day.
I found the waiting period difficult. It's probably the most difficult, because you almost felt like going outside and throwing up, Sitting around waiting for that telephone always had a certain ring, and the corporal would pick it up, then stick his head out the window and say scramble, and you'd be on your feet racing to the aeroplane. Waiting for that to happen, I think many people would say, I found it very unsettling, as it were. You were apprehensive and probably, let's face it, probably scared stiff, really.
The strain of weeks of intense fighting wasn't just affecting the pilots. It had also begun to tear the leadership of Fighter Command apart. War had broken out amongst the RAF top brass, about the way the battle was being fought. It pitted Keith Park, the commander of 11 Group, which covered the southeast, against one of the RAF's rising stars. Douglas Bader was already a legend when war began. He had lost his legs in a plane crash but went back to flying. In 1940, he led 12 Group, which defended the Midlands and the East Coast, an area which was less involved in the battle.
He was itching to get into action. He's the sort of guy who wanted to be out there leading the pack. He wanted to be number one. And the backseat role that 12 Group seemed to be playing in the battle didn't really appeal to him.
Bader had his own theory on how the Battle of Britain should be fought, which he called the Big Wing. The idea was to get dozens of planes in the air at once. In one huge battle, the Big Wing would deal the Luftwaffe a killer blow. But there were practical problems with the Big Wing. Getting 50 fighters in the air took time. The Luftwaffe was often halfway home by the time Douglas Bader arrived. For Keith Park, who knew just how short of men the RAF was, the Big Wing was a dangerous gamble. Risking dozens of pilots in a single battle threatened to fatally weaken fighter command. This shortage of pilots was the critical issue as the Battle of Britain reached a decisive point.
Airmen were not just being shot up by the Luftwaffe. Many were falling prey to a merciless killer. In less than a month, the RAF lost more than 200 airmen, almost all over the sea. As I know from my RAF training, if you ditch into the ocean these days, you're pretty confident you'll survive. We've immersion suits, lifeboats, and emergency supplies. So I want to know what was so different in 1940. What made the sea such a killing zone? Oh my God, that's so cool. Oh, it really takes your breath away, the shock. I'm only wearing a simple flying suit, just as pilots would have done in 1940. What I'm experiencing is known as cold shock. I've been in a few minutes now. My hands are getting really cold, my toes are cold. And I'm really breathing hard. I can feel myself hyperventilating. Hyperventilating was one of the signs of cold shock. Breathing became more frantic, and pilots would swallow more and more water. Most died from cold shock within 5 minutes. Anyone who did survive the first few minutes still had little chance of getting out alive, because during the Battle of Britain, there was no system to rescue pilots lost at sea. And just kind of looking around me, and it's quite choppy, and I can't see anything. I can't see any. I can see the odd ship every now and again when I'm popping up and down, but apart from that, it's just nothing. Well, it must have been absolute hell to think you've managed to survive getting out of your burning Spitfire, and suddenly this is going to be your final sort of resting place. It's just horrendous. To be honest, I think you probably just want to drown, get over with, because there's no hope really of anybody coming to see you. It must have been horrible.
If you're lost at sea or stuck up on a mountain, you'll be lucky and these guys will come and get you. They save up to 2,000 people a year. But it's because of the people, the pilots that ditched at sea during the Battle of Britain that we have search and rescue today.
With so many experienced airmen being lost, search and rescue began. Its main task was to pick up airmen lost at sea.
Oh yeah, that's him up ahead now. He's over here, up to our right. Oi, Colin! You freezing? No. You good?
As soon as you see that yellow helicopter coming, you just, it's just the most fantastic sight, you know?
Yeah.
My God, they're here.
Really, I've found a new job.
I mean,
I'm going to do this, yeah. I'm turning in my rouge and my lipstick. I'm going to be a winch man.
Oh, nice one.
Search and rescue was set up in August 1940. In the years to come, it would save thousands of lives. But it came too late to stem the losses which were seriously weakening fighter command. By early September, the RAF had reached its lowest ebb. They were losing far more pilots than they could replace. It was a war of attrition, and fighter command was bleeding men. It seemed that only a miracle could save the RAF from extinction, and Britain from invasion. Then, on the 7th of September, something remarkable happened. The Germans launched another huge attack. 750 Luftwaffe planes flew towards the RAF's fighter stations, just as they had done for the last few weeks. But this time they passed right over the airfields and carried on towards London.
The game had changed. It was now no longer about two air forces confronting each other, but it was about two nations confronting each other, because they came back to London that night, and the night of September the 7th can be counted as the first day in what we now call the Blitz.
A week earlier, the RAF had bombed Berlin. Goering had publicly declared that the German capital was safe from attack, so the bombing was a personal humiliation. He ordered a revenge raid on London. The Blitz would prove traumatic, but during the first week in which London was targeted, no bombs fell on air bases. Goering had eased the pressure on the RAF. Squadrons were re-equipped with new Spitfires. Fresh pilots were drafted in. Fighter command was overhauled in anticipation of the next great challenge. A week of foul weather followed the first day of the Blitz. Fighter command pilots were confined to base. Luftwaffe squadrons flying over Britain encountered very few RAF aircraft. Their reports convinced Goering that fighter command was down to its last 200 planes. Time was running out. He had only a few days left to destroy the RAF before Hitler's invasion had to begin. Goering believed that one more blow would crush fighter command. And with the bad weather breaking, the day of reckoning had arrived.
So is this going down to the command centre?
Yeah, this was the headquarters of Living Group, their ops room.
Right. Good, super top secret. It feels really secret down here.
I think it was secret. I don't think the Germans ever knew about this place.
No?
It was just kept completely under wraps.
9412 south.
RAF Uxbridge was the nerve centre on the 15th of September, the decisive day of the Battle of Britain.
I've seen this room in so many movies, have you?
Yeah, it's weird, isn't it?
It's a real place.
Weird to see it.
Yeah. Got this.
70 years on, the room has been preserved just as Keith Park would have known it on the day he scrambled his squadrons to meet the great Luftwaffe attack. The first few hours were crucial for the outcome of the Battle of Britain. For the very first time, we've pieced together the records for each phase of the German attack. These RAF personnel will help us plot the raid moment by moment. They'll be doing exactly what their predecessors did 70 years ago.
4079
And Stephen Bungay is on hand to take us through the key moments of the 15th of September 1940.
The weather reports are good, the day is fine, there's a little bit of haze on the ground, but visibility on the ground's about 4 miles. It's about 14 degrees centigrade. It's a beautiful late summer day. It's great weather for strolling to the pub, reading the newspaper in the garden, and launching major air attacks. And guess what choice they made? Right. So on they come, and Park here is waiting for them.
Keith Park didn't have to wait long. At 10:10, the Germans took off from their bases on the French coast. The bombers circled over the English Channel as they waited for their fighter escorts to arrive. Then Goering's great air armada began its attack run. Back in London, the Prime Minister Winston Churchill had noticed the fine weather. He sensed it would be another big day. He drove to Uxbridge and arrived at 10:30 as the drama began to unfold.
Park went up, met him, reminded him that he couldn't light his cigar because the air conditioning down here won't cope with it.
He was in here.
And so he was just up there with an unlit cigar clenched between his teeth throughout the day.
Stand by for a new raid. Hostile 04, William X-ray 06.
At 10:51, the first marker went on the board. 30 hostile aircraft had been detected by Britain's air defence system. It was the spearhead of the German attack.
All squadrons come to readiness, including those released.
At 11:03, Park scrambled the first fighter squadrons.
He sent out the Biggin Hill wing of Spitfires, 2 Spitfire squadrons, 72 and 92, up high to patrol Canterbury to hit them over the coast. He sent them up to about 25,000 feet. When they arrived, they were above the German top cover.
Park had laid an ambush. When the German bombers and their fighter escorts arrived over the south coast, the RAF was waiting, high above. Park's strategy was to send out Spitfires to engage the Messerschmitt 109s. The 109s would be forced to fight. That would strip the bombers of their protective shield. At 11:40, the first dogfights began. Park's strategy was going to plan.
While the dogfights raged, the German bombers pressed on for London. But now another unforeseen problem arose. A 90-mile-an-hour headwind had blown up, which cut the ground speed of the bombers in half. It would take them twice as long to reach their target.
Raid hostile 04, Robert 73.
Goering had promised that Fighter Command was finished, but German aircrew had endured a terrible ordeal. They'd been attacked on all sides since they crossed the south coast, and it was about to get even worse. Keith Park now delivered his masterstroke. He'd always been sceptical about the big wing and the value of a risky all-out attack. But it was time for the RAF's hammer blow, so he'd summoned his great rival Douglas Bader to lead the charge. At 12:09, the German bombers arrived over London. To their horror, 60 big-wing fighters were waiting for them. Bader launched an all-out attack. There were so many British aircraft that they got in each other's way. Only 6 German bombers and 12 fighters were shot down. But the appearance of so many RAF planes shattered Luftwaffe morale.
The psychological impact of this on the German flyers, of course, was shock. But on the commanders, it was a sudden realization of what had actually been going on for the previous month.
Yeah.
We thought we got them on their knees. Oh my God, we've been getting nowhere.
Yeah.
We've no time left. What can we do?
When the Luftwaffe finally tallied up their losses, the 15th of September had cost them 56 planes. They'd experienced far worse days. The real significance was what the battle revealed. After 2 months of fighting, the RAF was even stronger than before. With Fighter Command controlling the skies, the invasion couldn't take place. 2 days later, Hitler postponed Operation Sea Lion. Our journey ends here, at Capel-le-Fern on the Kent coast. This is the memorial to the 3,000 airmen who fought in the Battle of Britain.
Here's Douglas Bader, isn't it?
Oh yeah, yeah.
Most of them were British, but hundreds came from overseas to defend our shores.
It was Czech and Polish pilots, weren't there?
There are those who died 70 years ago, and those who survived. Men we've been privileged to meet.
There's Jeffrey Wellham's name there, isn't it?
Oh yeah, yeah. That's what I like about it, is that it's for the pilots who died and the pilots that lived. It's not just
it's for
not just a memorial of the dead pilots.
It's for all the airmen that took part.
Yeah.
544 RAF airmen were killed. Their average age was just 22. We'd like the last word to go to Spitfire pilot William Walker. At 97, he's one of the oldest survivors of the Battle of Britain.
Remember those not here today, and those unwell or far away, and those who never lived to see the end of war and victory, and every friend who passed our way, remembered as of yesterday, its absent friends we miss the most. To all, let's drink a loving toast.